Okay, we've seen last week and the previous week in chapter 7, Jesus has been in Jerusalem teaching in the temple at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. And there's been a lot of discussion going on concerning the identity of Jesus, and we've seen the various views and opinions that people held about Jesus. And we ended up in at the end of chapter 7 last week with an attempt being made to arrest Jesus, an attempt which failed because those who had gone to arrest him came back saying no man ever spoke like this man. And that didn't please the Pharisees, who'd sent the officers out to arrest Jesus, and they accused those who had come back as being led astray by Jesus. But Nicodemus, who was one of the members of the council, the Sanhedrin, stood up really and spoke on behalf of Jesus, saying that it's not right to judge a man before you've heard him. And that led to the Pharisees then questioning Nicodemus and accusing him of also coming from Galilee and telling him to look in the scriptures and he would see that no prophet is to rise from Galilee. So there's been a lot of this confusion and discussion going on about the identity of Jesus, this plot to arrest him and to kill him, all of which has come to nothing because we're repeatedly told that his hour had not yet come. But we come to another incident now which begins with the last verse of chapter 7 and goes into chapter 8, verse 11 as well. And this is the story concerning the woman who's taken in adultery. It's a story that reveals the compassion and the non-judgmental attitude of Jesus and the wise or clever way in which he dealt with his opponents. So we'll read the passage through here. It's chapter 7, verse 53 to chapter 8, verse 11. They went each to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such. What do you say about her?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the eldest, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus looked up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and do not sin again." This is perhaps a quite well-known story, and perhaps a well-loved story because of the way in which Jesus treats this woman here who's been caught in adultery. But if you've ever taken note of the marginal notes or the footnotes in your Bible, you may be aware that it's a passage that has some problems associated with it. Does this story belong in the Gospel of John to begin with? A summary of the situation is perhaps indicated from the footnote which we find in the New Revised Standard Version, which says concerning this passage, the most ancient authorities lack chapter 7, verse 53 to chapter 8, verse 11. Other authorities add the passage here or after chapter 7, verse 36, or after chapter 21, verse 25, or after Luke chapter 21, verse 38, with variations of text. Some mark the passage as doubtful. You may find some notes similar to that in version that you may be using. The new and also several versions indicate that there's some question about this by placing the passage perhaps in brackets. The New Revised Standard Version does that. It has this passage bracketed. The New American Standard Bible also, and the New International Version. The Revised English Bible and the New English Bible leave the passage out of the text of John's Gospel at this point, and they print it as an appendix to John's Gospel after chapter 21, at the end of chapter 21, and makes a note that the passage has no fixed place in our ancient manuscripts. So from the various translations, we see that there is some question mark over the inclusion of this passage as being part of John's original gospel. So we might wonder, well, why is this? Why is the passage being doubted or questioned in this way? Well, there's a number of reasons, really. First of all, the passage is not included in the oldest Greek manuscripts that we have. The most complete and the oldest Greek manuscripts that we have of the New Testament come from around the middle of the 4th century AD. And these are Codex Sinaiticus, which you can go and see in the British Library, and Codex Vaticanus, which is kept in Rome in the Vatican Library. And neither of these manuscripts contain this passage. If you look at those manuscripts, the text goes from what we would number as chapter 7, verse 52, and then immediately on to chapter 8, verse 12. So there's none of what we have read this evening is included in those manuscripts. Then also this passage is not included in the oldest versions, and a version is a translation from the original language. So in the case of the New Testament, that's a translation from the Greek language into another ancient language. So such as the Syriac, the Coptic, which is the language in Egypt, and the Old Latin. None of these versions include this passage. And then furthermore, many of the early Greek and Latin Christian writers, they're sometimes referred to as the church fathers or post-apostolic fathers, and they were around and writing from between sort of the 2nd to the 4th century AD. And none of those writers make any reference to this story, whereas they make other references to other things that Jesus did. So that would maybe perhaps suggest that they did not know of the existence of this story either. And then the internal evidence from the text itself suggests that it was not written by John. It's said to be not written in John's style. And there are words that are used in this passage which are not used in any of the other writings of the New Testament that are attributed to the Apostle John. So these are the main arguments, the main reasons against the inclusion of this passage in John's Gospel, and particularly at this point in John's Gospel. So if those are the arguments, then we might wonder, well, how did the passage get into our Bible? Why do we have it here at this point in the text? The oldest known manuscript to contain this passage dates from the mid-5th century AD, and that's known as the Codex Bezae. This is a manuscript that is written both in Latin and Greek in the parallel columns, and it's kept in the Cambridge University Library. But this manuscript is not considered to be a very reliable text. It contains a number of peculiar readings around certain familiar passages. So it's not regarded as being a very reliable witness to what the original text would have been. But this story is included in it. And then Jerome, who was a Latin writer working in the 4th century AD, he was working on a translation of the Latin Bible into Latin, which is known as the Latin Vulgate, which formed the basis of Bibles that are still used today by the Roman Catholic Church. He did include it in his translation of the Latin, which would suggest that Jerome knew of the existence of this passage and perhaps had access to some manuscripts that did contain the story. And then the church historian Eusebius, who again around the same time, 3rd to 4th century, he says that the story was known to a man named Papias, and he was one who lived around the end of the 1st century, so very close to the period around the end period of the apostles. And it said that he knew of the existence of this story as well. So later manuscripts then started to include it, which they did. If they did include the story, they often marked it with an asterisk or some indication beside the passage to indicate that there was some doubt over its inclusion in the original manuscript. Those manuscripts that did include the passage inserted it in various places. 10 manuscripts place it at the end of John's Gospel. 4 place it in Luke's Gospel after Luke chapter 21 and verse 38. So when we consider all of the evidence that's available to us, there is a lack of certainty about this passage and whether it was part of John's original gospel. There are 2 possibilities, perhaps at least 2 possibilities that exist. First, that it was part of the original New Testament text, which at some point in time became omitted from the manuscripts. It was left out. As the copies were made at some point, it became left out. And one suggestion is that it was omitted because it seemed to take a light view of adultery. Augustine said that it was removed because women might appeal to it as their excuse for adultery. And then later on, with the discovery of the story in some other manuscripts, it became included again. Another possibility is that it was never part of the original text, but rather it was a well-known oral tradition or story which later became incorporated into the text. And this could have happened if the incident had been recorded, perhaps as a marginal note by some scribe who had been involved in copying out the manuscript in order to illustrate what Jesus said in chapter 8 and verse 15, "You judge according to the flesh, I judge no one." So the story would then provide an illustration of what Jesus was saying there. So it perhaps came into the text that we have today, became included. What was originally a marginal note becomes included into the main body of the text. So although we cannot be absolutely certain about the history of this passage and where it should be placed in the New Testament, the story itself does have a ring of authenticity about it. The words and the behavior of Jesus are consistent with what we know of his character from the rest of the Gospels. The way in which he deals with this woman, similar to the way in which he has dealt with women in other similar situations. And likewise, the action of the scribes and the Pharisees in bringing this woman to Jesus in order to test him, again, is consistent with what we know about their behavior and their attitude towards Jesus. So there's a consistency in what is said here about Jesus and about the scribes and the Pharisees, which would suggest that it could be an authentic story. Perhaps it was a story that was floating around, that was well known, but didn't really have any fixed place. And then finally, through some manuscripts, it became inserted at this particular point. So the passage may not have been written by John himself. It may not be in its correct place in the New Testament, but it does appear to record a genuine event from the life of Jesus. In conclusion, that we can quote this writer Ralph Earl in his Word Meanings in the New Testament, who says that while the evidence is overwhelmingly that John chapter 7 verse 53 to 8:11 was not part of the Gospel of John as originally written, yet New Testament scholars agree that it is probably a correct oral tradition of an actual incident in Jesus' life, so it may be used for purposes of illustration. So we'll have a look at the story itself, because it is a lovely story. The opening verses of the incident provide the setting for us in chapter 7, verse 53 to chapter 8, verse 2. And it describes here the end of one day and the beginning of a new day. They went each to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. We read here of the departure of one group to their homes, whilst Jesus went to the Mount of Olives at the end of one day. And if this incident were to be in its correct place, then those going to their homes would be referring back to the chief priests and the Pharisees referred to in the previous verses. So at the end of the day, they all go home. Jesus leaving Jerusalem and going to the Mount of Olives, though, follows the pattern that we see of his activity during the last week of his life. And we can have a look in Luke chapter 27, verses 37 to 38. Luke 27, 37 to 38. And it's after this that some of the manuscripts place this story, and we can perhaps understand why when we read these verses. They're very similar to the verses we've just read in John there. Luke 21, verse 37 says, "And every day he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and lodged at the mount called Olivet. And early in the morning all the people came to him in the temple to hear him." So this was Jesus' activity, his practice during the last week of his life. He would spend the night out on the Mount of Olives and then come back into Jerusalem to the temple to teach. So that may be why some place this story at that point in Luke's Gospel. Also, this is the only reference that we have to the Mount of Olives in John's Gospel. And this would be one of the points made by those who dispute the inclusion of the passage in John's Gospel. John doesn't make mention of the Mount of Olives anywhere else. So the following morning, then, Jesus returned to the temple to teach the people. And the scribes and the Pharisees now approach Jesus, bringing with them a woman whom they say has been caught in the act of adultery. Again, here the phrase, the scribes and the Pharisees, is another of these statements found in this passage, which is not found anywhere else in John's Gospel, although it is a phrase found many times in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John doesn't use that, commonly use that phrase, the scribes and the Pharisees, and this is the only reference in John's Gospel to the scribes as a group as well. So again, that's the reason why some think that this passage doesn't belong in John's Gospel. But here we see the scribes and the Pharisees bringing this woman to Jesus. And the woman is brought and she's placed before Jesus in the midst of the people. Jesus has all of these people gathered around him, listening to him teach. And now this group of scribes and Pharisees come bringing this woman, who they place in the midst there amongst all of these people, in front of Jesus. And the scribes and the Pharisees now present Jesus with what they see to be a problem, that the woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses commanded that such should be stoned. So they ask Jesus, "What do you say about her?" What they say about the woman, what they say about the woman, that she was caught in the act of adultery, implies that there were witnesses who had seen her committing this act, that she's been caught in the act. So somebody, at least some witnesses have seen this going on. Well, if that's the case, then we might ask, well, where is the man that she was with? Surely the man and the woman should have both been brought to Jesus if they had both been caught in the act of adultery. So the actions of the scribes and the Pharisees seem to be deliberately designed to cause the woman maximum embarrassment. The man she has committed adultery with is nowhere to be seen. He's disappeared. So she alone is brought before Jesus in this very public way. and they give no thought to the shame and the fear that she must have been feeling at this moment. The scribes and the Pharisees referred to the law, which states that adulterers should be put to death. And they're probably referring to a passage such as Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 10, which says, "If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death." Or in Deuteronomy chapter 22, from verse 22, says, "If a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman, so you shall purge the evil from Israel." And then verses 23 and 24, a slightly different case. "If there is a betrothed virgin and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones, the young woman because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city, and the man because he violated his neighbor's wife, so you shall purge the evil from the midst of you." So we see that the law clearly stated that both the man and the woman should be put to death in cases such as this. But the scribes and the Pharisees have conveniently ignored that part of the law that says the man should also be put to death. So they present what they see to be this clear-cut case to Jesus. The woman is guilty of adultery. She's been caught in the act, so there are witnesses. And the law says that she should be put to death. And now they say to Jesus, "What do you say about her?" Their motives in bringing this woman to Jesus are now revealed. In verse 6 here, the text says, "They said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him." So the whole situation has been a setup to try to entrap Jesus. We see another occasion, which happened again in the final week of Jesus' life, recorded by Mark chapter 12, verses 13 to 17, concerning the payment of taxes. Again, it was a setup to try to get Jesus in trouble. Mark chapter 12, verse 13 says, "And they sent him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to entrap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, 'Teacher, we know that you are true and care for no man, for you do not regard the position of men, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not?' But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, 'Why put me to the test?'" So this was a method, a technique that his opponents were using. They're trying to create these situations to entrap Jesus. And again, with the case with this woman caught in adultery, that's what they're trying to do, to get Jesus to say something which would lead them to make a charge or an accusation against him. They thought that they had got him here. They thought that he would be unable to answer their question. They're not particularly interested in the woman. They just want to use her case to get to Jesus. Jesus is the intended victim of their plot. So they thought he wouldn't be able to answer this question without getting himself into deep trouble or incriminating himself in some way. So if he had said that, yes, she should be stoned, then they could accuse him of acting against the Roman authorities, because the Jews did not have the authority to carry out the death sentence, and the Roman law did not carry the death sentence for adultery. So if he gave that answer, then they could indicate to the Romans that Jesus was teaching against Roman authority, get him in trouble with the Romans that way. If he said that she should not be stoned, then they would accuse him of contradicting the law of Moses and taking a lenient attitude towards adultery. So that answer would then put him in conflict with the Jewish religious authorities. So whatever answer Jesus gave, then the scribes and the Pharisees were hoping that it would provide them with the basis for some serious charge that they could bring against Jesus. Perhaps they expected him to say that she should not be stoned, but knowing something of the character of Jesus, in which case then they would charge him with violating the law of Moses. The Sanhedrin could condemn him, and then Jesus would lose all influence amongst the people. So this is their intention. But Jesus' initial reaction is simply to ignore them. He doesn't answer, but instead he writes on the ground with his finger. No indication is given as to what or why he wrote. Some various suggestions have been made that he wrote the words that he would later speak, or that he wrote perhaps some of the words from the law, or that he wrote the names and the sins of the men who had brought the woman before him. And there is a 10th century Armenian version of the story, a manuscript that has him doing that, listing the sins of those who had brought the woman. I'll just read this version of the story. It says, "A certain woman was taken in sins, against whom all bore witness that she was deserving of death. They brought her to Jesus, he would demand, in order that they might malign him. Jesus made answer and said, 'Come ye who are without sin, cast stones and stone her to death.' But he himself, bowing his head, was writing with his finger on the earth to declare their sins. And they were seeing their several sins on the stones. And filled with shame, they departed, and no one remained, but only the woman. Saith Jesus, Go in peace and present the offering for sins, as in their law is written." Another number of different variations of that in that version of the story there, but we see what that story is saying is that Jesus was writing on the ground the sins of those men who had brought this woman before him. Others think, well, he wasn't really writing and just doodling on the ground, showing his contempt for their question, but really we don't know what Jesus, because we're not told. Jesus' silence doesn't satisfy the scribes and the Pharisees, though, because they persist with their question. We're told that they continued to ask him, so they kept on asking him. And finally, Jesus stood up and he made his answer. "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." Jesus' answer must have stunned them. Who but Jesus could come up with an answer like this? His answer did not contradict the law of Moses. It did not treat her sin lightly. In fact, he admitted that she could be stoned. That's what the law said, but only by those who themselves were without sin. So the whole situation had been set up not in the interest of justice, but in order to trap Jesus. And in Jesus' answer here, he is really calling upon her accusers. He's turning the tables on the accusers and calling upon them to examine their own consciences. Could you, in all good conscience now, throw a stone at her? Well, having given his answer, then Jesus resumed writing on the ground. And as those around him thought about his words, we're told that they went away one by one, beginning with the eldest. So did they go away because Jesus' words had convicted them of their own sinfulness, or was it because they realized that Jesus had masterfully defeated their plot to entrap him? There was nothing in the words of Jesus then that could possibly form the basis of any charge against him, and so they all just drifted away. And eventually Jesus was left there alone with the woman standing before him. And Jesus then spoke to the woman for the first time. He asked, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And the woman answered, "No one, Lord." Her accusers had all left without condemning her. And then the incident closes with Jesus' words, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and do not sin again." Jesus will not condemn her. He will not pronounce judgment against her, but neither will he condone her sin. He tells her to go and sin no more. So she is being given another opportunity here. She is being told that she needs to amend her life so as to refrain from any further sin. In the end, there is no evidence against the woman. Everyone else has gone. There are no witnesses. And so no judgment can be passed upon her. So her case is, in effect, simply dismissed. But she is told that she needs to go away and sin no more. Thinking about this story, then there's a number of lessons that we can draw from this. One of our common faults is that we demand higher standards from others than we do ourselves. And we are critical of the faults in others, but we're blind to our own faults. When the scribes and the Pharisees brought the woman to Jesus, they were blind to their own sin of self-righteousness, until Jesus said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And then perhaps they began to think about their own situation. This ties in with teaching of Jesus that we find in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, in verses 1 to 5, where he says, "Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." So sort yourself out first before you start trying to sort other people out. Another lesson that we can learn from this is that usually our first reaction on hearing of some sin that someone has committed is to condemn. We're very quick to condemn. And this was what the scribes and the Pharisees had done with this woman. Jesus' first reaction, though, was not to condemn, but rather to have pity. And when we hear of sin in others, our reaction should be the same, not to jump to some conclusion and condemn, but rather to seek to understand and to help and to realize that we too are capable of such sins. There but for the grace of God go I. And we have to extend to others the same pity and compassion that we would like to receive ourselves if we were in a similar situation. Paul in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1 tells us how to behave in this sort of situation. He says, "Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Look to yourself, lest you too be tempted." So we have to be aware of what we ourselves are capable of and deal gently with those who may be caught in any transgression. We also see in Jesus' treatment of the woman that he did not take her sin lightly. He said he would not condemn her, and he could not condemn her because he himself had not witnessed what she had done. But he also told her to sin no more. In effect, sentence was deferred as Jesus gave her another chance, an opportunity to put her life back in order. And Jesus never treats any sin lightly. Sin is something that is serious. The woman had done wrong. Jesus acknowledged that and told her that she needed to change her life. And that's the challenge that Jesus presents to her and to all of us as well. So perhaps a few things for us to think about and reflect upon here. Does it bother you that questions are raised about the authenticity of this passage? We looked at some of the reasons why doubts or question marks have arisen over its inclusion in John's Gospel. Does that concern you at all? And then do Jesus' words, so let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her, mean that we should never judge another person's behavior? How are we to understand that? Did Jesus forgive the woman? And what would be necessary for the woman to be forgiven? So a few thoughts there, a few questions perhaps to reflect upon as we come to an end of our study this evening. So we'll